Here is a training tip that you can put straight into your workout today without having to completely reprogram your whole training. And it follows the idea of a double peak contraction. And you can think of the peak contraction as the fully contracted position of the muscle where we are stimulating those muscle fibers and creating that growth potential for hypertrophy. We know that tension is one of the most important aspects involved in hypertrophy. And so throwing in these double peak contractions can greatly benefit you, in my opinion. And you can almost think of a peak contraction as the mind to muscle connection. And Mr. Cavalier from AthleanX also has a nice quote when it comes to this idea of focusing on the squeeze of a repetition. And he says that it's never enough to just move a weight from one place to another. You must move the weight with a focus on contracting the targeted muscles as hard as you can when you reach full contraction. And so a double peak contraction is where you perform a full range of motion repetition immediately followed by a partial range of motion repetition. And that would count as one repetition, those two movements. And so, for example, with a bicep curl, I can do a full range of motion bicep curl followed by a partial range of motion bicep curl. Full repetition, partial repetition. Full repetition, partial repetition. And therefore, what we are doing within one set is doubling the number of peak contractions we have within that movement. And again, this is just a useful variable for stimulating your muscle. And so note to self, don't film for YouTube after you've just completed a volume session. My arms were absolutely dead by the point I was filming this. The peak contraction is valuable. And I believe that these double peak contractions are valuable. However, we must also consider the strength curve. And so it's for this reason that we have to use variations in our exercises. For example, the lateral raise, we can use the lean away lateral raise to create tension at the top of the movement, the traditional lateral raise where we create tension at the mid-range of the strength curve, and we can also use in front of the our body cables and behind the body cables. So we are manipulating where we feel tension on the strength curve. And it's the same for the bicep curl. You can do your traditional bicep curls, or you can throw in variations such as hammer curls where you're recruiting the brachioradialis muscle. So most certainly it's important to consider the strength curve of a movement. Where do you feel that tension? And also the peak contraction. And so in my opinion, it's very beneficial to use double peak contractions and to use variations within an exercise to make sure that you work through that strength curve. Now, when you do your partial rep, you can actually lower down to different ranges of motion and hit different tension points during that exercise. So with the bicep curl, I can do a full range of motion repetition followed by a small partial rep or a larger range of motion partial rep. Now, here's an important principle. The larger your range of motion in this partial rep, the harder it will be. The shorter the range of motion in your partial rep, the easier it will be. Let's use these generic terms, easier and harder. And so why is this important? Because it will affect your intensity. It will affect the amount of weight that you can lift over that rep range. Let's say, for example, you are doing bicep curls for 10 repetitions. I would recommend, if you're doing double peak contractions, to keep your partial rep range of motion the same throughout that set. And in that way, you can make sure that you've programmed your weight correctly. If you are changing your range of motion every partial rep within one set, it's going to just mess with your intensity. But if you do want to change the range of motion of your partial reps, do it from set to set. Change it from set 1 to set 2 rather than within one set. You also need to consider the type of movement, very basically compounds or isolated exercises. I prefer to do these double peaks on isolated movements for safety for one reason, but also because for me it's easier to create that conscious mind to muscle connection. Now, if you do it on compounds, here's the difference. Where your range of motion on your partial rep may recruit more muscles or less muscles. For example, in the bench press, if you do a full range of motion bench press and then you lower down only slightly for the partial rep, you're going to keep more of that tension on the triceps. And obviously the deeper you come, the more you're going to recruit the chest and the anterior delts, etc. So with compound movements, because there are many muscle groups involved in that movement, It really will influence your partial rep, really will influence the more or the lesser amount of muscles you recruit during that movement. And it's also valuable to have a static hold on the peak contraction, 2 to 3 seconds. And Mr. Thibodeau has a great quote on this static conscious peak contraction. And he says that this maximal contraction greatly increases the average intramuscular tension during the set, because you can generate more force in a maximal static contraction than during a submaximal concentric contraction. And these small static holds on the peak contraction can increase this EMG measurement, which is essentially motor unit activity. We want a greater amount of motor unit activity. With these 1.5 reps double peak contractions, you can also focus on the tempo of your repetition. So generally speaking, if you're going to do 10 sets of a barbell curl, and you're going to throw in these double peak contractions, you're going to have to lighten your weight slightly to what you're used to using, especially if you're going to have that static hold at the top for a few seconds, and if you're going to work through a slow tempo through the whole movement. And essentially, there's debate with every training method in physical fitness. And sometimes you can get so weighed down by the different arguments. But in reality, sometimes it's just worth applying solid principles and training. And as long as you're progressively overloading with that training, you're going to see results. And I like to think of it as, sometimes there's not the best way to do something. There's just different ways to achieve your goals. And so I hope this was useful. I'm James Linker. This is Shredder Sports Science. I'll see you soon.